Friends, welcome to episode 2 of season 3 of the Inspired Human podcast. I'm Dairus, and Nick is here to continue our conversation about following Jesus in the You Do You era. In episode 1, we discussed what the You Do You era is, how it looks, tastes, and smells. If you have not listened to that episode, I encourage you to go and listen to it for context. However, we're going to do a quick summary. I think some stories can really illuminate what we talked about last time and are continuing to talk about today. So Nick, why don't you give us some ideas from our everyday lives of where the You Do You era shows up and kind of controls our narrative?
Yeah, a defining feature of life in the modern West is that we're actually somewhat aware of how society is so inhumane, but we are unable to think up or dream or imagine a way out of this. We didn't make that up. I mean, it's not like you and I made up this idea. I mean, Alan Noble and others, Charles Taylor. I mean, people have been saying this for a while. Modern life in the West, it's inhumane, but we can't think our way out of it. And when we say inhumanity or inhumane, we're talking about everything from abortion to war to mass shootings, widespread cover-ups of sexual abuse, even stuff like jobs that appear almost meaningless. We're talking about broken communities. We're talking about what it is that that compels a large section of society to binge watch Netflix so regularly to give us an escape from our anxiety. We weren't made to live like this. You remember episode 1, zoochosis, lions who pace back and forth in the cage. And most of us know it. What's odd about this, though, is that our standard of living has skyrocketed, but our quality of life hasn't. So yeah, we have heat and air conditioning, and I love that, by the way. I love air conditioning in Hawaii in the summer.
It's good in Florida too.
I love endless entertainment, right? But the real things that mark a life that's worth living, stuff like shared purpose or love or relationships, truth, beauty, these things are very, very poorly defined in our society. They're in short supply. So what have we done? We've turned inward. To be fully human is to be authentic to yourself and you above all others, right? You do you. Find a job that makes you happy. Follow your heart to whatever identity path you choose. And no one can tell you you're wrong. Choose to keep or walk away from your commitments because you need to live your truth. You like that saying? Your truth. We hear that a lot. But in the background of all this, in the era of you do you, it's become silly to even think that God interacts with humans on a personal level or that he holds the whole world in his hand. I mean, it's a children's song, and it's like a joke. It feels silly to think that life can be permeated by God's Spirit, moving and illuminating and comforting to bring about God's good, right, and just purposes for the world. I'll take the words you used, the words of Charles Taylor. We've lost our transcendence.
So it sounds like we are closed, left to our own devices, and the whole world is closed and left to our own devices. And we're kind of stuck with all the things you just talked about, all the inhumane ways that we have found to be human in this existence. I love that.
Yeah. Closed, like me draining my spaghetti noodles last night after I, you had pot you pour it into in your sink so the water goes through it. And yeah, okay. Closed, meaning like once upon a time, people thought the world had holes in it and God was permeating, interacting, pouring through it. But now we're saying, yeah, it's like somebody put a bunch of paper towels at the bottom of that pan. I'm trying to drain my spaghetti. Do you like that analogy?
That's a great one. Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
You have a thing with strings. We talked about yarn last time, and now it's spaghetti. I love it.
Well, maybe I eat too much spaghetti.
Okay, well, what does this have to do with us following Jesus? And is there any relation to the Bible?
Yeah, I think this has partly influenced my thinking over the years. I know I'm not alone, which is why I think we're chatting about it now. We've seen it in our ministry. So here's my story. I mean, I grew up like learning the Bible, great family, involved in our local large evangelical church. That was my background as a young kid. And I remember learning like, hey, Philippians talks about joy, and the book of James talks about persevering through trials and hard times. And they were almost just I don't know if anyone ever said this to me, but it was almost like, hey, feeling sad, read Philippians, or hey, you're having a hard time facing the trials, read James 1. And it seemed like it was medicine, which at the time, honestly, it kind of worked. It kind of made sense for a kid to read those things and be heartened and encouraged. But as you get older, as you mature, as life's problems become more complex and just frankly messy. So now I'm talking about like high school, college. For me, it's like seminary, young adulthood, early military career, early military life. You kind of learn that like, oh, okay, like that doesn't quite work. You don't just say to someone who's encountering deep depression, read Philippians 1 and chapter 2, and then let's talk about it. I mean, it can be a part of their healing journey, but I just learned early on there's got to be other tools that God has provided humans. And thankfully, yes, we've got science, neuroscience, mindset stuff, positive thinking. We've got behavioral psychology, all this stuff that like athletes use, elite athletes, elite soldiers, that they use to be the best. But here's kind of my journey. I didn't like replace the Bible with this science, but it did take me some time to figure out how they related. Because look, if I didn't do the hard work, if I didn't have people in my life to speak into me and ask me deep questions, I think it would have been easy for me to lose my sense of transcendence, to think, well, I can think my way out of this. I can take the right medicine to get out of this. I can just focus on the right thoughts or mindset, talk to the right counselor, and I'll get out of this. But that would mean I think the world's closed, that God doesn't live and work and have his being in me and through the world. So, Dairus, I guess, let me ask you this. This is something you've studied a lot in your work at Baylor. I mean, how'd this all happen? Not just to me, but like in society. How'd we let the story that tells us Jesus is the answer, bro? How'd we let that story get completely absorbed by some of the good stuff we've discovered in behavioral sciences and all that?
Yeah, first thing I think of is any number of books written by former Navy SEALs when you talk about this. Just read that. Get out of bed a little bit earlier and make it. All great things. But I think the reason why that's so exciting to us, not only because we're closed, but because we're storied creatures. And what do I mean by that? There's this philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre. He wrote a book that is just a watershed moment in modern philosophy called After Virtue. And he claims that humans are at our most basic level, that we are storied creatures. And his work coincides a lot with Charles Taylor's. So I'm going to quote a little bit here. He says in that book, After Virtue, a central thesis is that man is in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, essentially a storytelling animal. And he goes on to talk about how we can only answer the question, what do I want to do today, if we first answer a question before that, of what stories do I find myself a part? And then he contemplates very well of how our only way to get into society, our only way to be a member of a group or a family or a nation, is to pick up the stories that are told and to then become almost like it's a drama on a stage, like a theater, to live out the script as an actor in that story. And he goes on to say, the narrative of any one life is part of an interlocking set of narratives. Narratives are just stories. It's me breaking in there. All attempts to elucidate the notion of personal identity independently of and in isolation from the notions of narrative, intelligibly and accountability are bound to fail. All of such attempts have. So what's he saying here? He's saying that the idea or the attempt that we've been making in the modern world to create and curate our own story, disconnected from any other set of stories or overarching story, fails, and they all have. And so, Nick, I think what you have clued us into by the stories above is the you do you era tells a story that we are the creator and curator of our own story, that through science and psychology, with the right inputs and mindsets, we can figure everything out.
Yeah, I appreciate those words, because you're saying what you're saying and what you're quoting, and then really essentially elaborating on is that if our story is just on us, right? Like if it's just us, we're the center, we're the main character, we're the protagonist, we're the antagonist, we're all the things, then it comes up empty. It comes up, frankly, too heavy, too difficult. That's what you're saying?
Yeah. Think of, remember the String in the late 90s and the early 2000s where Eddie Murphy made all those movies where he was the director, the producer, and every character? That is a beautiful cinematic picture of what I think we're describing here.
Yeah.
So kind of to wrap up, kind of like and wrap up at least what we're talking about as storied creatures and how we got to where we are the center of the whole drama, is that for our story to be authentic, it must be expressed publicly. We talked a little bit about authenticity last time, and that for it to be public, it must be recognized by an audience, and that those who affirm the drama that we are creating and acting out on our own, they're good people. And those who disagree with our story, well, they're oppressive, they're mean-hearted. And so the you do you era says to only go with the audience that affirms your identity, that affirms the story you have created and curated by yourself for yourself.
Interesting. Yeah.
But herein lies the issue, I think. We cannot exist outside of a greater narrative. And I think that's what Alistair McIntyre is getting at. That the lie that the you do you era tells us is that you are a blank slate upon which you can write whatever tale you want for your life. The psychology and the science you referenced earlier simply disproves this. Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, talks clearly in the first part about how the psychological idea that humans are blank slates at birth is completely incorrect. So we're born into a world that has a narrative, an overarching story that pulls us into itself and propels us through life toward a certain goal or an idea of what a good life is. The trick with the you do you era is that we are led to believe that our story is our own. Simply believing that is signing up to live the script of individualism and not our own story. We're being drawn into a greater story. So human life cannot exist apart from a grand story that provides direction and purpose for which we live out our individual lives. So the you do you era does have a story. As we've spoke on the last episode, that story leads to, and you even hinted at the beginning, leads to pros and cons. And so I think what we want to drill down here, Nick, is what does a Jesus follower do with the story that tells us we could write our own story?
Yeah, that's a lot. It's a lot of words like they're like, we said a lot of things: story, narrative. And what we're getting at, and here's where we're driving is that everyone's a part of a grander story, whether you want to believe it or not. You're bought in somewhere, right? You're either bought into the you do you narrative, you're bought into the narrative of hyper individualism, or what we're trying to help ourselves and frankly really help ourselves, and then hopefully you as well, is to let the scales fall off our eyes so we can see the grander story that we should be a part of. And that's okay. So let me chat about that, because Jesus is not just like the X factor that needs to be added onto your story. He's not like the secret sauce. But this is all over the place. Egregiously too in the church, we see it in the health and wealth gospels, that faith is just added to your life. And faith, however ill-defined it is for that community, it becomes the X factor that brings you deliverance from poverty or your annoying significant other, or to justify whatever it is.
Jesus helps you live your best life now.
Your best life now, brother. That's it. But central to this idea is that we are the center of our story. But friends, we are not the main character of our lives. We aren't. Christ is the main character. We are the supporting castmates to that story. So following Jesus in the you do you era means seeing ourselves as actors in God's story, not seeing God as an actor in your story. We're not seeing God as an actor in your story, but you see yourself as an actor in God's wider, beautiful story of redeeming the world, restoring the world, of setting all things right. So let's slow down. Let's unpack this. It's seeing you, all your choices, how you think and move and have your being in this world as absorbed into this grand narrative. It means we're dethroning ourselves from the role of main character. And there's tons of implications here. Think about this. When we call Jesus Lord, which is the New Testament word, it's like swearing ultimate allegiance to a king. We're saying we swear ultimate allegiance to Jesus as our king. So that means there are some jobs that you should say no to. There are some industries that you shouldn't get involved in. There are some stores or product lines you shouldn't buy from. There's some things that we shouldn't do or say when we're angry at our spouses or at our kids or at our employees. It means we should use a different set of criteria when we're trying to help our kids figure out what jobs they should pursue or what degrees or trade they should consider. That it's not just find whatever makes you happy. It's not just do what is fun and work will never be work. I mean, those are okay, great. We live in a world where we can actually ask those questions, but perhaps it's saying, how does this job, how does this occupation, how does this degree, how does this trade contribute to the broader grand narrative that Christ will return someday and set all things right? How are we joining him in that work now? So look, I mean, we're supposed to be the odd Christians. We are. We're supposed to be unique. If you don't like the word odd, okay, unique. The people who, we're the folks who don't live by the same ethics or guidelines or criteria as the rest of the world. And in the era of you do you, it all starts with reframing, reforming how we think about our lives, that we're not the main character, but we've been gifted, graced with the opportunity to be active participants in God's overarching plan, his vision, his intent for redeeming and restoring and renewing the world by his Holy Spirit. So that's where we're moving. That's what we're trying to do. But Dairus, what's the meta-narrative we find in the story of God in scriptures? Unpack it for us.
Great synopsis. Meta-narrative, that means grand story. What is the big story that is God is telling and acting out on the stage of human history in the world? Michael Goheen and Craig Bartholomew wrote a killer book. If you're listening, I highly encourage you to pause and go get it. We're not sponsored by them. That would be really cool though. Mm-hmm. But it's a book that changed the way that at least I view the world. And I know this has been the foundation of a lot of what Nick and I talked about throughout our whole friendship. It's called The Drama of Scripture. And it places the Bible almost as a script for a play. And they talk through 6 acts, like acts in a play, through the whole story of the Bible from beginning to end. And if we're to make a simple outline, this grand story that God is telling starts with creation. The next act is rebellion. And then we find God calling Israel as the rescue project, in which Jesus fulfills what Israel failed to do, who launches the church by the power of his Spirit, all awaiting when the King, Jesus himself, will return to restore, renew, and relaunch creation.
6 acts: creation, right? Rebellion, mm-hmm. The story of Israel as the rescue project. I love that language. Jesus fulfilling that. Number 4, into the acts of the church by the Holy Spirit, leading to renewal. I love it.
Yeah. And so we could fill out those acts a little bit more. So it's kind of think about from the beginning. We look at the very beginning pages of Genesis 1, and there's nothing but this being called God. And he's so powerful that he could speak one word and everything we know and love comes into being. And then within that, he places at the pinnacle of that creation his human offspring, humanity, male and female. He makes them to bear his image, which means that they reflect out to all creation his goodness and his love and his creative power. And he gives them the blessing of being the leaders of his creation. And they're led astray. We see in Act 2, as the curtain closes on Act 1 and opens for Act 2, we see they're led astray into rebellion against God, who functions as king of the whole cosmos, who can speak things into being. And they try to become kings for themselves. They try to live under their own law and write their own story apart from the story of God. And that plunges them and all of creation into, well, a life separated from its very source, from the King himself, God. And so as you mentioned, God, the King, begins to call his children and all of his creation back to himself through a family named Abraham, which then begets Isaac, which then begets Jacob, who is named Israel. And we have this entire nation of people who were formed to be God's family on earth, pointing to the whole world what it's like to have the Creator God as your God. And they're given this covenant and multiple covenants, and part of it is that God will return one day to establish his kingdom on earth. And Israel is just meant to live in right and good relationship with this God as he works in and through them to redeem the whole world from darkness. Well, they fail, and that's where Jesus comes in.
Yeah, Dairus. Okay, so who's the main character in this story?
I'm glad you asked. So far, we've covered the Old Testament. That's a big, sprawling narrative. Mm-hmm. And so who's the main character? He's the one who was the first one mentioned in the whole story, God himself. And at times he fades behind the scenes, and Israel or one of Israel's neighbors come onto the scene, or a prophet or a king or a priest, but always operating either on the stage itself or somewhere in the background is this Creator God who is pulling and drawing all things through this story to its completion. And we see that most powerfully when Jesus arrives on the scene. And so we have John chapter 1, famous passage of the Bible, where it tells us that this Jesus guy, he's the Word of God, who was with God, who existed with God, and all things were created through him. He comes and dwells among us, that the very Creator God of the universe in some mysterious way becomes human and lives and moves and breathes, sleeps, probably had acne and body odor, had to eat. Yeah, got tired when he walked too far, just like you and I. And he lived in this world as the perfect child, the perfect son of God, and did everything that Israel was called to do, but couldn't. And so Jesus fulfills Israel's rescue mission. And through his life, his death, his bodily resurrection, and his ascension, which is just a fancy church word for rising into heaven to sit on the throne of the cosmos as its king, he brought God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And let's just pause for a minute. Kingdom is foreign language to us, is it not? We're Americans. I think of the Monty Python movie. We don't want a king. We're a democratic republic. So maybe let's just insert here. Talk to us for a second about the kingdom and a king for us Americans.
The kingdom language is still ripe for us, even though it is a tad foreign, because we can't say, well, Jesus is the ultimate president or he's the ultimate prime minister, because in the modern West, the people have the authority to get you out of here. We're going to vote you out or impeach you or whatever, so that language doesn't work for the actual role that God has in the story. King language still makes a lot of sense, because when you picture a knight swearing ultimate allegiance to a king, you picture that knight taking a knee in front of that king, maybe even holding their sword in two hands, flat like a plate or a table, holding it up and essentially saying I'll do anything you ask of me. I am no longer, my will no longer guide my overarching life. Yes, I still get to probably choose what I eat, who I marry. I still get to probably choose what schools my kids go to and stuff. I mean, now I'm kind of breaking into this metaphor. I don't know if knights really sent their kids off to school, but the knight can make those choices, but they're all framed they're subsumed under these vows that the knight is essentially taking, right? So to me, the language still makes sense, however antiquated it might be. And I appreciate the nuances, but we're going to stick with it, I think, right?
I love that example, Nick, because the knight is not always in the presence of the king that he's sworn allegiance to. And the king is not always in the presence of the knight. And so we have this with the understanding of the part of the story where Jesus rises out of earth into God's space, into the throne room, the CEO's office of the world.
Sure. Yeah. At the end of the Gospels, you're saying.
Yeah. You can find it in explicitly. Luke talks about it quite a bit. Jesus is no longer bodily present with us. And yet, because we've sworn allegiance to him, this story, as we meditate on the creation, rebellion, Israel, and Jesus portions of the story, we begin to pick up this narrative and this script so that in the absence, the physical absence of the king, who's present with us by his spirit, we, the church, which is the fifth act, we then begin to do an educated improvisation. We begin to, because we've meditated on the story that's before us, we can then act in the world in ways that are congruent with our king's intent.
Improv,
absolutely. Educated improv. And so that's where the church falls in. The last act, or the fifth act of this story, is the church improvising the life and the love and the justice of the king as they go about living physically in the kingdoms of the world, and yet as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, as Paul would say in Philippians, living as signposts, pointing towards this story, pointing towards this alternate way to be human, until the human one, Jesus, the King himself, returns to make all things new, to bring heaven and earth back together as they were meant to be, to renew the earth, to restore it to its creational glory, where it's never to decay again. No one will die again, where he'll actually wipe every tear away. And so the church, between the king rising to his throne and the king returning to earth, we're empowered by the Spirit, the life force that brought the king out of the tomb, to live and to point towards that day. And we do this as the church by living this story, by imbibing on and studying and meditating this story, so much so that it becomes the script, the hidden transcript by which we live our lives in this world. And so to kind of just wrap that up, the triune God, the living God, is the main character. Jesus is the hero pulling it all together, and we are in a supporting role in this divine drama, empowered by the Spirit, waiting for our King's return.
So that story obviously is going to confront the you do you story, right? I mean, they're not compatible, right? So so I mean, let's rapid fire. Let's give some just practical stuff. Like, what are a couple big societal themes or ideas or zeitgeist, if you will, where we see the conflict happening?
Yeah, great. The missionary Leslie Newbegin says that this is the most true story of all human history, and that if it's proclaimed and lived well, it will always create a confrontation and encounter with the prevailing stories of the day. So one huge one, oh my goodness, Nick, is sex, the place that it holds in our lives. The you do you era says that sex is transactional, that it's casual, that it's not sacred, that it's just something that friends do as an extra benefit. Sex is a way in which you build your identity, whether it's through the actual sex act or sexual expression. But God's story says no, that sex is a sacred act between a man and woman who love each other for their whole lives, that shows God's glory through their mutual self-sacrificial love of one another, blending two bodies into one, that doesn't create an identity, but sex in the biblical sense creates a community. I think another wild way in which this story of God confronts the you do you era's story is that of generosity. The you do you era says, take, take, take. I think of the phrase that he who dies with the most toys wins the race of life. And it's all about you, the consumer. If it feels good, buy it. If it feels good, eat it. If it feels good, drink it. Just hoard it all to yourself. And God's story says, no, actually, God owns everything there is. He created it all. And as king, he has rightful say and claim to everything, from quarks in the quantum realm all the way up to the entire rock on which we call Earth. And so in that, the story teaches us to give it all away without question, because it's not ours anyway. We are stewards or caretakers of everything that God has made and given us.
Yeah, I like that. And your words even make me think of other things like love, right?
Yes.
Love in the you do you era says it's contingent on a lot of things, right? It might be contingent on just one thing or maybe many. I mean, do you make me the best version of myself? Do you support me as the main actor in my life story? Do you add value to my life? Or, hey, do you force me to sacrifice? Of course, and let me just caveat, we're talking about healthy relationships, right? I mean, certainly we're not even attempting to talk about abusive relationships right now, but we're talking generally healthy relationships, right? Mm-hmm. In the you do you era, sacrifice is not a popular idea. The idea that I might actually adjust who I am a tad to allow my spouse to thrive even more, which should happen. The biblical notion for that is submission.
Yes.
And no, wives are not the only ones who should submit to their husbands. Clearly, the next verse, Paul says, to all Christians, they should submit to one another in love, right? So submission.
Talking about Ephesians 5.
Yeah, in Ephesians 5. I mean, because God's story says God is love, which means love at times is self-sacrificing. How do we know that? Because Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering, right? Not contingent. I mean, identity too, right? So identity is another one. You do you era says you have unlimited options for how you can curate or create your identity. Unlimited. Just don't kill anybody, right? Just don't do anything crazy to hurt someone else, right? But God's story actually gives us limits. It's like how structure is married to the creativity process. So these are God-given limits that keep us from falling into the paralysis and anxiety that we talked about in the last episode. And I mean, look, every healthy relationship has boundaries, including the relationship you have to yourself. So boundaries are a good thing, right? They keep us grounded and healthy. There's tons of other ways we've talked about in this episode. How you think about what job you'll take, what you'll study, where you'll live, what you'll buy, where your shirts were made from. It's unbelievable the ways that the two narratives clash.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned identity. The story that God tells has a rich identity for everyone who would live according to the story. I think one of the popular calls of the you do you era is that any kind of big narrative, I'm talking about, there's like some French philosophers, postmodern philosophers say that any kind of meta narrative is inherently oppressive and it will crush your individuality. And that's just simply not true of God's story. The identity he gives us is one of thriving and vibrance. And as we give ourselves away in mutual healthy love and submission to each other, we actually find our hearts and our lives enlarged. So how do we wrap this one up, Nick? We've been talking for a while.
Yeah, we covered a lot, but I think they get the point. You have to start chipping away at the grip the you do you era has on our hearts and our minds. And we're recommending, we think that you have to start by reforming how you think about your place in the world or your place in God's story. And so let's just simply end by saying this cannot and should not just be done alone. Like ideally you're a part of a church, right? Who worships and knows you and loves God. And each week you are reminded of these things as you take communion or Eucharist, as you hear the word preached. I mean, does that sound right? I mean, that to me, that's where we go. So in the next episode, Dairus and I are going to talk about how the you do you era has hijacked faith And I mean how we understand faith, how we think about faith, what society tells us faith should be, but what actually we see faith looking like in the scriptures. Okay, friends, that's it. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.